The book of Job is really a theological and philosophical deep dive into a very difficult question, a question that people have struggled with for millennia. It dares to ask, why do bad things happen to good people? But if you read the end of the book, as we did this morning, I think you are struck by another question that is almost as difficult to deal with. Because the book tells the story of all these terrible things that happen to Job. He loses all of his possessions to marauding warriors. All 10 of his children, 7 sons and 3 daughters, are killed in a horrible accident. And he suffers from sickness so severe that he is in constant pain and suffering. And all of these terrible things that happen to him do set up the discussion of the question of why do these kinds of things happen? But that's not quite what the end of the story is about. In many ways, the end of the story raises an issue that is just as important in our present circumstances, however. It leads me to ask, how is it that people can recover from trauma and the losses and the bad things that have happened to them? In many ways, the end of the book of Job seems to give this perfect picture of recovery. After losing everything, including his health, Job gets it all back. He recovers physically. He gets all of his wealth back, which is actually presented as a kind of precise calculation. Because, of course, wealth in that world was mostly measured in livestock. And so Job gets back precisely twice as many sheep, twice as many camels, twice as many oxen and donkeys as he had before. And don't tell me that's a coincidence. There's got to be a message in anything as precise as that. And in the same way, we're told that Job got his children back again. Once more, it was as an exact calculation. He lost 7 sons and 3 daughters, and he gets back exactly the same number of both. Again, that is no coincidence. So there you go, right? Everything lost is back again. Trauma over. All's well that ends well. Except it really doesn't quite work that way. Recovering from trauma is never as simple as just getting everything you lost back. Never. And you might think, based on these details that are given, that the book of Job really fails to reckon with that reality. It just suggests that a happy ending is getting everything back. But I think that's not quite right. In fact, if you pay close attention to the story of the recovery of Job, you will see actually how hard it is for Job and for the people around him to really recover, what they have to do. But in order to understand that, you may need to consider the story from the point of view of someone who lived through it. Like, for example, from the point of view of Job's eldest daughter and how she might have told the story. In fact, I think that's what we need. I think we need to hear Aunt Jemima's story. Oh, come in. Come in, my children, and come and sit at your Aunt Jemima's knee. For I've got a story to tell you. And you need to hear this story. You need to hear the story of my father, your great-grandfather Job, because he is going to come and visit later this afternoon. You need to know his story before he gets here, because this is it. Your great-granddaddy had some terrible, awful things that happened to him many years ago. He lost everything he had and everything he held dear. Not only everything he owned, but also everyone that he loved. He had 10 children in those days, 7 sons and 3 daughters, and he lost them all in a terrible, tragic accident. my beautiful babies. You have no idea how much Job wept for those children. And your great-granddaddy tried for days on end to understand why all of this had happened to him. He knew he'd done nothing wrong, nothing to deserve such a tragedy. And he spoke to his friends to try and find the answer. In the end, he even spoke to God, and God came to answer. But did God ever explain to Job why such terrible things had happened to him? Well, not really. It was more like God overwhelmed Job by talking about all the complexity of the universe until Job just gave up his arguments. Because you see, my children, sometimes you never get a clear answer to the question of why something happened. But the good news, my children, is that your great-granddaddy made it through all of that. He survived. And he came out the other end of all those struggles. And he got his possessions back, twice as much as he'd had before. And blessing of blessing, he even had 10 more children, 7 sons and 3 daughters. And I, Jemima, am the first of those children. But here's what you need to know today, my children. Job loves me, and all of his children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. He loves you so much. But when he comes today, it may not seem that way. And instead of smiling and laughing, he'll probably weep when he sees you. He will weep because you remind him of the children that he lost. And no matter how many children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren he has, all of them together cannot replace even one of those that he lost. Because lost children never work that way. Never have, never will. Oh, I know that sometimes someone trying to comfort someone who's lost a child will say that. They'll say, hey, can't you just have another child? And that's sometimes the hardest thing for a grieving parent to hear, because they know that they don't just want another child. They want the one they lost back. And what's more, having once lost so much, Job also lives in fear of losing it all again. And that has made it hard for him just to enjoy what he has and to show love. You see, recovery from loss, especially the loss of children, is just that hard. So please be gentle and loving to your great-grandfather when he comes, because that is what he needs most. Oh, my children, I don't think many people understand just how hard it really is to recover from that sort of trauma. I mean, especially when a whole generation is lost in some sense. You know, I once heard the story of a tribe who lived far away from this land of Uz. And they were invaded by a foreign people, a people who came in and occupied all of their territories. But the new settlers treated those who had been living there before them as if they were just ignorant savages. And they decided that it would be better if their entire culture were just eliminated. And so they took all of the children of the people of the tribe away from their parents. They took them and put them into schools where they were not allowed to speak their language or practice their culture or religion. And many of the children were also abused in various ways. And yet, much to the disappointment of the settlers, these original people, they survived. Yeah, many of the children died, but the people as a whole survived. But then they found that survival brought its own challenges. Because you see, the children didn't really know who they were anymore after what they'd been through. And when they had their own children, they had no parenting models at all because they hadn't known their own parents. They had nothing to follow. And so even after the original destruction was brought to an end, the effects of that trauma kept on being passed down from generation to generation to generation. And that's exactly what Job didn't want to happen for his family. And so he worked hard to make sure that it didn't. And so, dear children, I want to tell you the measures that your great-granddaddy Job took, because you may need to take similar measures someday. So, children, what is the first thing that Job did that helped him to recover? Well, he accepted help. And that's exactly where too many people fall short. Because you see, when you've been through a hard time, and when you have struggled mightily and yet managed to survive, you may have a tendency to withdraw. I mean, you don't want to talk about what you went through. That stirs up so many difficult emotions. And you may also feel the need to be more self-sufficient. But that's really not going to work. Recovery that lasts, always happens within a larger community support system. And so Job found that community of support. Oh, he had to be choosy. Not every friend was going to be particularly helpful. In particular, 3 of his so-called friends, the ones who came and argued with him that he deserved all of the bad things that happened to him, well, they weren't going to be much help. So he prayed for them and just let them go on their way. But then, you see, there came to him all of his brothers and sisters, and all who had known him before, and they ate bread in his house, and they showed him sympathy, and they comforted him in all that he had gone through. See, they understood. And to them, Job could really talk about what he had gone through and all of the emotions he'd struggled with. And that, just that, was such a necessary step in his recovery. For it allowed him to begin to build his own story of what he had gone through and what it meant to him. And that became the beginning of his new story of who he was and where he was going to go from there. And so, some sympathy and some listening ears meant a great deal for him. And the people who came to him were also actually the beginning of his financial recovery. For each one then also gave him a piece of money and a gold ring. And so, my darling grandchildren, never forget that you need the help of good and trustworthy friends in order to recover from your trauma. Oh, but there's something else that your father Job did that saved the future generations of his family. Something that you should never forget. It was about his children. As I said, he had 10 more children, 7 new sons, and 7 fine daughters. But here's the funny thing. If you go and look at the records of our family, you will not find the name of any of those sons, not one. Now, Job loved his sons. There's no question about that. But you see, he lived in a world that put all of the emphasis on his sons. They were the ones whose names were supposed to live on. They were the ones who were expected to build the future. But Job, after all he had gone through, decided that the recovery and the future of his family needed to be led from someplace else. Job had 3 daughters. Jemima, was his firstborn, and then Kezia, and the third, Karen Hepuk. And you all know our names because your great-grandfather resolved that no one would ever forget his daughters, because he knew that his daughters would be the best leaders for recovery from trauma. He even made sure that his daughters would inherit an equal portion of all his property together with his sons, which, of course, is quite unheard of in our world, as you know. But Job understood what far too many people fail to realize: that there is no recovery from tragedy if women are not a key part of it. You know, there was a time when banks and development agencies tried to help whole countries recover from poverty or natural disasters by making investments. But they made a mistake. For they chose at first only to invest in traditional economic drivers like government or established industry. And this was often not successful. Sometimes it drove corruption and embezzlement, leading to a high failure rate. But then they discovered something. They discovered that if they gave loans to women, even really small loans to start small enterprises, it almost always drove economic growth that helped the whole community. Now, this may have something to do with how women prioritize family and community and want to build for the next generation. It certainly has something to do with how women are often the carriers of important traditions that they keep and pass down, kind of like I am doing when I tell you this story today. And Job understood that. People told him that he shouldn't make so much of his daughters and that he shouldn't let them inherit alongside his sons. But Job knew better than anybody, the trauma that he'd been through. And in order to make sure that the scars of that trauma didn't get passed down to the next generation and the next until it came to you, a wise decision was made. And if you ever get a chance to help people recover from trauma, you need to keep that in mind as well. So, my children, that is the story that your Aunt Jemima has for you today. Now, great-granddaddy Job is going to come soon, so all of you go and put on your best clothes and wash your faces and get ready to greet him with the biggest hug any patriarch has ever received. I know that people often turn to the book of Job to try and process that very difficult question of why bad things happen. It's useful for that, even if it doesn't quite give crystal clear answers, probably because there are no crystal clear answers. But yes, I've always loved this book and how it helps people to deal with that difficult question. But I've always had a few problems with the ending of the book. I mean, yes, it does say in the end that Job got everything back, everything he lost, including a full set of replacement children. But that always kind of troubled me. Because I have tried over the years to minister to many people who've gone through traumatic loss. And I know that just getting back what you lost is not the same thing as recovering. And I also know that it never helps parents get over a loss of a child, of all things, by suggesting that they could just have another one. So this time, as I read the story, and especially as I reflected on Jemima and her sisters, I realized that maybe this story does have more to say about recovering from trauma. That in fact it does lay out some steps that do help a person to recover from devastating loss. So let me say this today. If you have suffered from any kind of trauma, any kind of loss, if you know someone you love who has suffered something like that, I would counsel you, first of all, to never underestimate the impact of the wounds and the scars that the traumatized carry. They are serious, and they do not just affect you, they may also be passed down in your family. So be wise like Job, and take steps to deal with your trauma. Find safe and supportive people who you can trust, who will listen to you and help you process what you experienced. And yes, in some cases, you may need professionally trained people to help you do that. It can make an enormous difference. Do not be afraid to ask for help. We all need help sometimes. And yes, if you're able to, make investments of those who will build a better future for yourself and for your family and for everything you want to leave for generations yet to come. O Lord our God, I know there are many who have suffered a great deal of trauma in their lives, a great deal of loss. And yes, these very troubling recent months have brought more than their share of trauma. Help us to look beyond just getting back what we lost, but actually dealing with everything we have gone through in productive and constructive ways with the help of your Holy Spirit.